Okay, the meeting is now going live stream. This is great. I think it's a good time to start. Hello, everyone. The Canadian Cybersecurity Network is excited to be hosting our fourth monthly webinar as part of a new monthly cybersecurity topics. This is something new we started to do in 2023, and I think we'll continue with the idea because there is many great companies and topics we have. Today's panel is focusing on remote work and security solutions, consumer technology trends now embedded in the enterprise, driving up the risk for security leaders. The proliferation of SaaS apps and services, remote workforce, and more all expose you to raft of insider and outside threats. Data compromise is often just a mouse click away. You definitely know how not to click on every link you see. Employees want a consumer technology expertise, but you board expect an enterprise-grade security. The browser is a perfect example, and it's now the most used application in the enterprise. But it wasn't designed for enterprise use. We will explore how we can make the browser more secure and different ways to secure our day-by-day life. This webinar is recorded and will be available on demand. We'll put a link in the chat where you can find the webinar later on and also see the other webinars we recorded in the previous months. Please use the question tab and ask questions. We will get to all the questions, maybe in the end, maybe in the middle, depend on type of the questions. Also, something new this month, as part of Canadian Cybersecurity Network, we have t-shirts now. So 3 people who are going to join today will win the t-shirts. We'll put the link to the people that won the t-shirts in the LinkedIn group later on after the webinar. Thank you very much for joining, and let's start the show. Brian, can you please tell us about yourself and the company?
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you mentioned, my name is Brian Kenyon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and part of the founding team at Island. About a 24-year career in cybersecurity. I actually started my career in cyber at a startup called Foundstone, which was in the vulnerability management space. Eventually acquired by McAfee, where I spent 11 years before taking roles at Blue Coat, eventually acquired by Symantec. And all of these paths ultimately led me to the creation of Island with Dan Amiga and Mike Fay.
So you work in many companies that I think in a way are fundamental to the security history of what we know so far. And I believe the browser security space is basically a next evolution of what we've been doing for the last 15, 20 years. I would like to pick your brain and go back in the history to explain to the people that are listening to us right now, how did we get here? Where we started? Why do we even need URL filtering? And at least this is the basic, I think so.
Yeah, no, I think it's, so, the browsers have been around. I mean, you go back to the days of the original browser wars between Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator and what those days look like. But Internet Explorer has long been a part of our life. And I can go back, even when I was starting my career, the conversation was, how do we govern internet access? And internet access wasn't necessarily a tool to get your job done. It was something people enjoyed to do in between meetings, on their lunch breaks. They would go and check scores, maybe go and look online as online shopping started taking off. And so when you look at the early onset of URL filtering, it was more about an HR tool than it was cybersecurity. It was, please keep these users from going to sites that, could bring workplace harm or harassment or bring topics into the workplace that weren't safe. So URL filtering very much started as an HR extension. And, you remember companies like WebSense back in the day, and, there was a bunch of technology, and that's what it was focused on. And then more and more, we started to see that attack surface grow. And, much of the web started to become a natural delivery mechanism for malware, for spyware, for other types of capabilities that could come in through downloads and through access on a website. And so That's when we really started to see security capabilities start to make it into those URL filters. So those URL filters started to become secure web gateways. And secure web gateways started coming with not only just URL filtering, but malware inspection, anti-phishing. And so we saw more and more security capability make it into those appliances that lived at the egress points of our networks for years.
I remember the days that when I was actually had the experience or the opportunity to check one of the first next generation firewalls to understand how UTM is working and how to inspect HTTP protocols and SMTP protocols. And I remember the days when you click on download and then you kind of feeling you have the file, but you don't have the file because you need to wait for the Web Sans Blue Code or whatever the system you have to check it out and let you know if it's actually good or not good. Right now, definitely the speed is so quick and so fast that we don't need these problems, but it used to be a problem. Still could be an issue when you download a very big file and you don't know if there's anything or something bad in this file. And URL filtering is not the only security controls we need. There's many other things. There's phishing attacks, there's spam attacks, there is malware files. And when you work on-prem and when you leave the office and kind of go home, I think it's totally made sense in the past. But when you're now traveling and you have your laptop everywhere with you, and sometimes you have your work everywhere with you, a lot of stuff changed. So let's kind of dive in there. Like, what really changed?
Yeah, I think, listen, people have been traveling for work for a lot of years. And they would typically go to other offices. You'd go to visit another office, you'd plug into the network there, and your security stack was mostly relegated to the network. So as long as you were plugged into an office network, you were able to get the right URL filtering, the right malware inspection, the right types of capabilities that you need for security. But like, as you said, we started seeing a lot more work go down in Starbucks. We saw a lot more work go down in these public Wi-Fi areas where people could just start doing their jobs. And so we started thinking about how the architecture would have to evolve. And the next big step or next big evolution we saw in this was more cloud-based cleansing. So all we really did was we took the on-prem thought process of a next-gen firewall or secure web gateway, and we moved it to the cloud so that we could try to get traffic from these traveling workstations, these laptops, these roaming users, so we could try to backhaul all of that traffic to a centralized place where we could do the inspection, where we could do cleansing, where we could add security services on top of the capabilities that existed on the device already.
So browser security, enterprise browser, is actually relatively new. I think before COVID, we didn't even know it exists. It's all pretty much started for the COVID. There's a number of companies beside Island, but I don't think any of them are started before COVID. Having said this, we had a number of companies that doing browser isolation or remote browser isolation. Can you explain the topics between the remote browser isolation, local browser isolation, micro isolation? Because I think it's very confusing for everyone.
Yeah. So I think, listen, this is again an evolution in the ways we've tried to secure browsers. So if we go back almost a decade and a half ago, we knew the browser was going to become a more prominent part of enterprise IT. And so organizations started thinking about the browser from a security perspective. And what they tried to do was say, listen, Internet Explorer, Firefox, these browsers that you download and are starting to use for business aren't secure by their very nature. So what we're going to do is we're going to put them in a micro VM on the endpoint or on the laptop or desktop itself. And so when the user goes to execute and open that browser application, it's actually running in a little sandbox. So if it gets compromised, no malware or malicious code can escape that little sandbox and your endpoint is very safe. It was very much at a time when browser exploits were in vogue, right? That's the way people got malware in the system, was to exploit vulnerabilities in the browser. The challenge with those technologies is, if you remember back in those days, you would click the Internet Explorer tab, and if you could even have this type of technology run on your laptop, because The chipset had to be Intel V Pro. You had to have enterprise chips. You had to have high-end hardware platforms to even run this type of virtualization sandbox. But if you did, and you double-clicked it, you sat there and you waited a minute for Internet Explorer to launch. And that user experience was frustrating. It was awful. It took forever to browse the web. And it made you think, why is this so difficult? Why can't I just open Internet Explorer? And so those attempts in that micro VM really failed at the beginning because the end user experience wasn't there. So we fast forward a couple of years. And in fact, one of our co-founders, Dan Amigo, actually started this, what we call remote browser isolation or RBI space.
Yeah, I remember Fireglass.
Fireglass, exactly. So Dan started Fireglass, which was the evolution of taking a Chromium-based browser and putting it in an isolated hardware, so like virtualized hardware. So at that point, you were doing all of your browsing, all the execution and rendering of that browser was happening in a virtualized container in the cloud. And it used the principles of like virtual desktop infrastructure to paint your browser screen with just an image of the website. So what ended up happening is if the website was going to push malware, the malware executed and compromised the browser that was running in a virtual image in the cloud, and your browser was completely left unpenetrated, your endpoint was completely secure. This has been a prominent way that folks have deployed security to the browser. The challenge is, again, we go back to user experience. Folks don't use this technology for 100% of their internet traffic because, frankly, the user experiences, it brings us back to the days of Bromium and Vinci with the micro VM. And so since then, we've obviously evolved quite a bit. Our attackers have evolved quite a bit. And the Chromium open source package has evolved right along with it. And so a lot of the capabilities that we were leveraging for RBI, remote browser isolation, are now built into the core of Chromium. And so with Island, by having our own version of that Chromium open source project, we're doing a lot of the things natively that you required that cloud compute to do before. And so we've seen that evolution of micro VM, push the VM in the cloud, and now to a more native experience back on the endpoint.
So I guess the native question for people that are listening to us right now is like, okay, if something exploded in a cloud, then I don't care. But if something exploded in my laptop, how do we can safely say it's not going to contaminate everything else? And does it mean that every tab in your browser is actually isolated from one another?
Yes. And that's, by the way, that's a natural component of Chromium, is across the tab isolation, is each browser process is its own sandbox process. And so where we've gotten a lot of development advancement is on that sandboxing inside Chromium itself. So when you couple that with things that we've done with our Islands version of Chromium, like being able to dynamically disable the just-in-time compiler, being able to change the code flow and the code guard of Windows, those additional components with the security built into Chromium is giving that isolation experience natively without the need to explode in the VM.
In this case, so Chrome has an enterprise version as well that costs money. Just to explain to people that are listening and not be confused, there's a different set of features that you guys provide that not available in the enterprise browser, in the enterprise Chrome, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Enterprise Chrome was really built, it's very much a device thought process in its management. Managed Chrome was very much brought about through the evolution of managed Chromebooks. And so when you started bringing Chromebooks into the enterprise, you needed a way to be able to manage it, just like your other Windows estate or Mac estate, as you do today. And so that Chromebook management started, and as an extension, the ability to manage Chrome with an added extension that you put into that Chrome browser showed up into this console. What Chrome Enterprise really affords you is a lot of configuration of how the browser behaves for a user. So think about who gets developer tools and what extensions could you have loaded. There isn't the concept of how do you work with data? What is the data you're accessing? What are the controls you should have around data? And so it's far more about browser configuration and not at all about user policy, user awareness, what the user can do and where they can go. And so it's very great for configuring the browser, but it doesn't really help you from a data security perspective. And the way I like to think about this, right, is listen, Edge is touting some features, business features as well. Obviously, Chrome's touting some business features. These are very interesting, but when you really understand our policy engine, you really come to the conclusion that you couldn't do that in a consumer browser because frankly, those consumer browsers don't have the security built into that Chromium code base. They're built for 5 billion users, right? They don't have the controls around the copy and paste buffer. They don't have the controls around upload and download because as a user just downloading, if your browser prevented you from downloading something, you'd probably be pretty upset. I make it akin to, we still live in a world where we buy Windows versions for home and Windows versions for business. And why? Because they have different components in there. They have different capabilities. You can actuate different parts of that OS with policy. I think of this with the exact same thing as a browser. Downloading Chrome and Edge at home, perfectly fine. There's security built in. But when you bring it into the enterprise, we need a whole new host of capabilities that we've never had before.
So I'm going to piggyback on this.
Yes.
Let's go deeper.
Okay.
You mentioned enterprise.
Yeah.
Do I have to be an enterprise? Can I be an SMB? Can I be 50 people company? Or like, where is the intent? Now people listening to us right now and look on this later on, like, oh, this sounds exciting. Do I need this? Or do I need to wait to become bigger?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, a lot, today, Island is very fortunate, in our 3-year journey, we're at 72 customers, which is very exciting for us. But of those 72, we have a handful of what you would consider small, medium business, right? Maybe 500 employees, maybe 200 employees or fewer. In those customer base, they see Island as an enterprise browser as a majority of their actual security stack. They don't need a web filter at that point. They don't need a CASB to invest in at that point. They get those controls directly from the browser itself. And so those organizations, frankly, are invested heavily in SaaS applications because that is the way for them to very cost effectively scale a business, right? And so being SaaS applications, most of their security can be delivered through the web browser. And so coupling us with some endpoint protection, as well as some endpoint encryption, as well as some compliance tools to ensure PCI or the other things they need to comply to, becomes a very robust security stack for the small medium business.
So it's interesting what you're saying, that if I start a company tomorrow, in what point, and you mentioned I'm a native cloud company, I do all my development in the cloud, I use Gmail, Outlook, whatever I want to use. I use basically the cloud tools from development. In what point I can get something like Island? The moment I get my IAM tools, do I do EDR first or Island first?
The moment, so, depending on how many SaaS applications you've deployed as a company, Island can be your first solution or it can be your second or third solution. So as you deploy more SaaS, the next step you're going to want to do is look at IAM solutions, right? You're going to want to provide a single sign-on. You're going to want to federate across those SaaS applications. We can be before that purchase or after that purchase. Most organizations, find the most value after an IAM solution's been deployed because you can leverage the conditional access capabilities. You can leverage the sign-on policies to ensure that Island's enforced and that they can't get to the SaaS apps with other browsers. So yeah, I think for the most part, our customers see us adding the most amount of value after identity solution.
Gotcha. For the folks listening to us right now here on Zoom, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, please ask questions. We would definitely want to answer the question. It's a very interesting topic. Think about the technology was not available like 2-3 years ago, and now it's become one of the major trends in the industry because it provides very interesting security capabilities to you as a company owner or enterprise leader as well. I have a couple of ideas where to take it, but I think let's kind of try to take one that was on my mind. For the last 4 years, we have this idea of SASE and SSE, Secure Access Service Edge, and the SSE part as well, that basically concentrate the cloud web gateway, CASB, and ZTNA. In your mind, are you complementary? Are you replacement? Where do you see yourself?
It's a great question. So let me give you my personal view on SASE or SSE or whatever it is we're supposed to call it at this point. This is the next evolution of us looking at our architecture and realizing that we need to extend it. And we may have reached the end of where our architectures could extend, right? And so if we go back to the conversation around remote workers, we were talking about, okay, well, before they were going to remote offices, so they would connect in and get their connectivity there, and our solutions would be on the network so they're protected. That's when hotel Wi-Fi wasn't as prevalent, airplane Wi-Fi wasn't prevalent, Starbucks Wi-Fi wasn't prevalent. But now we live in that world. And so what we've done is we've embarked on these SSE, these ZTNA connectors, these technologies that bring your traffic from wherever you are in the world, whatever network you're connected to, back to a centralized network where we can impose our network security on top of you. And that might be controlling where you browse with URL filtering. It's going to be controlling what data you're allowed to send via DLP. It's going to be checking files for malware with, sandboxes and the like, and on it goes with our security technologies. This is the same exact security stack we had on-prem, now just moved to the cloud and moved to these remote access points. The challenge with these environments long-term is it's all predicated on our ability to break in the middle of that encrypted traffic, SSL traffic, and impose our will. Either inspect files, pull files to a sandbox, look at the headers, look at the actual HTTP request, determine if it's there or not. More and more of our application traffic, I'm not talking Amazon and CNN and YouTube. That's very easy to do. It's a very simple connection. But when you look at things like Office 365, when you look at things like Google Workspaces, even Salesforce and ServiceNow are opening up multiple connections, multiple sockets to the browser. They're doing a lot of asynchronous communication. That's how you get all of these applications to work well. Your ability to agilely and at wire speed break and inspect that SSL and impose security services on top of it is starting to erode. So the ability to do that, and this is where we see the enterprise browser having value. So to get a very long-winded answer to your question, here's where Island can play today. For organizations that have gone down the SSE path, that have invested in that, have it instrumented, have it deployed, Island can extend its value, meaning an enterprise browser can programmatically direct traffic where you want it to go. So rather than deploying a redirection agent or some reach agent to that system, the Island browser can direct that traffic to your SASE provider, your SSE provider, your cloud URL provider like a Zscaler or an iBoss. However, if you're an organization that hasn't embarked on that path yet, you're going to find all of the controls that can be delivered through an SSE engagement can be deployed and governed with policy inside of Island. So that architecture, that network traffic, all of that work can be bypassed purely by just pushing an enterprise browser.
Interesting. And I'm trying to think about, do we take it to explain more about encryption? Because it's a fascinating topic. Because back in the days, I spent quite a lot of time with firewalls. And every time you wanted to encrypt packets, and right now, based on Google statistics, I think more than 97 or 8% of the traffic is encrypted.
Yeah.
There was a need to deploy certificates, there was a need to talk to HR, probably in your case as well. But it's not as easy as it sounds, or at least some of the people tell you. Explain, how does it change with Island? Why do I don't need to do majority of this work?
Yeah, so the whole need to break encryption is entirely because we are putting the controls outside of the browser and on the network. And so if you're telling that control to do its job on the network, like you said, 98% of the traffic's encrypted when it comes to HTTP. So it can't do anything with encrypted traffic. It can't see files, it can't see the data. So what it has to do is sit in some sort of zone where there's a device that opens that SSL connection, allows the DLP or the sandbox to inspect what's happening on the wire, and then puts it back together so that the server on the other end that's hosting the application is unaware something was in the middle. That's very hard to do very fast. It requires a lot of hardware, a lot of CPU work, and it's becoming increasingly difficult on SaaS applications. Now we can talk about things like cipher strength, right? So whether you believe quantum or not, or whether you believe that there's going to be a quantum event when it comes to our cyber certificates, the reality is there will be. And so as we move to post-quantum certs that are quantum resistant, the amount of hardware and CPU that it will take to break and inspect that traffic becomes untenable. So why Island is different here is because we do things pre and post encryption, meaning at the browser layer, by the time it gets to the rendering engine, everything's already been decrypted, meaning the cert has already been matched, the data is decrypted, the clear text code is pushed to the rendering engine to actually be displayed to the end user. We sit at that point where it's in clear text. So our DLP, our anti-malware scanners, all of those security controls can be ingested and actuated at a time when the data is not encrypted.
I think it's important to elaborate here.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we tapped on this. So you actually doing local enforcement. If you can compare it to antivirus, for example, you don't need the cloud management or to actually do the enforcement. You do everything locally. Is this correct? And can you maybe talk more about how it's done and how often you need the management to download new policies, for example?
Yeah, so when it comes to enforcement of the browser, meaning, I'm going to Salesforce or ServiceNow, or I'm going to an application, I can only get there with Island. I can't get there with Chrome or Edge, or if I go there with Chrome or Edge, I'm not allowed. The way in which we do that in enforcement, think of it as like a matrix of methods. The most popular method by far is by integrating with conditional access capabilities at the IDP or at Azure AD. And so you can use those conditional access or sign-on policies to enforce the use of a specialized browser like Island. And so from that perspective, we can forward the authentication traffic to Island to validate that they're actually in an Island browser that's cryptographically tied to the organization's tenant. And then if they are, we forward the authentication request onto the application provider. So if they went there with Chrome or Edge, that authentication traffic would originate from an unknown location and it wouldn't be authorized. So from that perspective, that's one method. We can also do a variety of methods at the endpoint and at the network in between. So there's many ways to enforce the usage of Island on the system. So that was one aspect of the question. What was the second one?
It was just basically, if we do local enforcement, do I need to go to the management to download new policies or not?
Yeah, so the only thing the browser checks the management console for is updated policies. All the traffic, it's not like Island sits in the middle of the traffic to an application, it's browser to app. So the browser can be configured to check for the policy at an interval that the company wants. It's by default, it's every 5 minutes. You can switch it to every minute, every 30 seconds, whatever you want to tolerate on your network for the browser to phone home and check.
There's a question here.
Yes.
So you want asking about, do you recommend Brave browser to use or any recommendations and why? So I think Brave browser is one that's done based on Chromium as well.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you explain what you know about Brave browser or difference between Brave and Island anyway.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So there's a number of Chromium variants out there. Brave is one of them. And each of the Chromium variants have taken theirs and really had a mission around it. And so if you ask me what Google's mission is with Chrome, it's obviously to advance their ecosystem and their capabilities, whether it's search, ad, the extension ecosystem, the app ecosystem, et cetera. If you look at Microsoft's obviously trying to monetize Bing at a great deal. Brave's was a little more altruistic. Brave had started with their own commerce around ads and being able to monetize the ads for the user, but they've switched very quickly to speed and privacy. They want to be the fastest browser out there. They want to be the most private. But when it comes to privacy, want to be very careful. It's individual consumer privacy, not organizational. So Brave, in the realm of Chromium-based browsers, is much like Chrome and Edge in that it has no additional capability for the enterprise or for corporations. And so great browser to use in your personal life, your personal world, but when it comes to enterprise applicability, there's much lower.
What are, in your mind, enterprise features? You mentioned some of them, like anti-malware, DLP. Maybe you can list more of them. But what other enterprise features that you think are important and people need to be aware about them, like plugins, for example, or whatever else you think is important?
I will tell you, the next big advancement of things of generative AI and the rest, everybody is rushing to have an organizational policy around ChatGPT and BARD and all these new, large language models that are out there, as well as the generative AI. And right now they're doing things like blocking the URL, right? You can't get the ChatGPT. The next incarnation of all these tools, and we're already seeing it, is going to come by way of extensions. So how do you manage extensions that are coming into the enterprise now that are the generative AI capabilities that you are blocking from the URL? All these things are going to start coming in. Organizations are going to have to grapple that. Yes, Chrome Enterprise has some capability around extensions, but think of it like a sledgehammer. It's a blunt tool. You can either allow it or disallow it. With Island, you can allow or disallow, but then when you actually talk about the applications, I can get another level granular and say, you know what, I'm going to allow you to have this extension installed in your browser, but when you come to my corporate applications, I'm going to unhook it from memory. So you can get another level of granularity. Most of the browsers have no understanding of user context, right? So meaning they don't know who the user is, what they should be allowed, what their entitlements are, what their role is in the company. And so there is no personal contextualization around that user, meaning when they open the browser, it's not tied to their business. It's not their homepage. It's not what applications they can get access to. There's nothing about it, about them or their business reflected in the browser. So that's missing. The data controls, right? Not just can you upload or download, but what can you upload? What can you download? Where does it get stored to? Is it encrypted? That's a business value. The other areas around the security, one of the craziest things is there's all these freeware tools for Chrome. Chrome Pass, Chrome Escape. All these things go and read your password files. They read your cookies and session tokens. And they're able to do that because if you think about it, there's one singular build for Chrome and everybody downloads it. And it's the exact same for everybody. Island affords the ability for folks to bring their own key. We can encrypt the elements like session tokens and passwords and things that people save in the browser completely differently so these third-party tools don't run. So I don't think we have enough time, but there's a significant amount of enterprise features that are frankly missing.
Okay, let's dive to features. Give me some cool features or cool use of Island that your customer are using that you didn't expect they're going to use.
Wow, man, that's a lot. So, one of the first ones we saw was one of the large airlines we work with integrated it into their privileged access management system so that they could stuff credentials. So when they went to a site that required privileged access management, the browser could check the credentials out and stuff them on behalf of the user without the user ever knowing that the credentials were changed or what the credentials were.
I mean, the browser will go to the PAM solution, like Psychotic, CyberArk, all of them, and over API take the credentials?
That's exactly right. And so that's the interesting thing. So one of the capabilities we've built into Island is something we call robotic process automation. RPA has been around a long time, but what it is for us is it allows us to build little modules of code with JavaScript and execute those JavaScripts with policy. And so what those will do will actually change how the rendering engine behaves. And so what does that mean? Well, it can change the way the application works for that user. So I'll give you a great example. We have a hospital system that is any practitioner or nurse or PA or doctor that's accessing a patient record that is in the ICU, if they make a change to any of those patient records, when they go click submit or save whatever the EHR application says, we actually force an MFA for that practitioner. So it pauses them to put their code in, make sure that we put the change as well as the MFA so they can see, this is what you're saying, now put your code in here, is this the change you really want to make? Things like that we could have never dreamt of at Island when we were building this, but once an organization sees it and starts thinking, how could I use this capability? Because injecting an MFA is just a standard capability in Island, and you can just select it via policy and say, I want to do it on this particular transaction. And that's what they do for those little records, for those EHR records.
Quite an interesting cool features.
Yeah.
Any fancy reporting that people see now with Island were still not able to see before?
Yeah, so the reporting is a very big area of value for us because, some of the challenges, again, when your controls live on the network, you can report on what you see on the network. And so you can report on things like top level domain. Yes, Brian went to Salesforce, but because on the actual browser, I can provide the full path URL. So what page of that application was I specifically on when I did it? We can pull things like images of the DOM. So I can pull a screenshot of what was actually rendered to the browser screen, something you would never be able to do on the wire because it's not constructed on the wire. It's just a 1 or a 0, right? So in the browser, I can say, I want a screenshot of that screen when the user was interacting with it. I can capture everything down to keystrokes. What did they actually type into the screen when it was loaded? So the fidelity, quality, and depth of data that I can pull as being the actual application itself is far more than anything you could ever get from them.
Can you explain what's DOM mean for people that are listening? Because I
Yeah.
think it's a very specific to the browser industry. And if you don't know what it is, you'll be like, what? Where?
Yeah, so in the browser world, you'll often hear of us talk about things as DOM objects, or it's the document object model. And it's basically the instruction set for how things need to be rendered to the screen, the order of which, where in the screen layout it should go. It details a ton of instructions. And it's the way in which you could think of a browser cataloging its instructions. So if you were able to look at a DOM object table, you could almost do so in an XML file and see it very logically in its instruction set.
Thank you. Is people using Island in this case for their internal applications to understand the user experience? Because I can have little reporting where people click on how they use their internal application.
Yeah, they can. And so not only can you get, like we have organizations who are using our, taking a picture of the user's screen in administrative consoles, because it's not even that they're doing anything wrong. They want to understand what changes they're actually making in those consoles, how they're using the tools. They can actually see, how does this user go through and make a change? How does this other user go through and make a change? It's very interesting from a business flow perspective. The other interesting part that Island can do is, obviously Chromium has its own performance metrics. Now, these are above and beyond what they expose in developer tools. So Chromium inside its own code has performance metrics. So what Island's doing is we're now exposing these metrics back to our customers. So it can tell you, what are the hops between my user and the application they're connecting to? Where is latency being introduced across those hops? How long does it take to, query a script? How long does it take to fetch it? How long does it take to execute? How long does it take to render it? So we can produce back very, very detailed metrics on what the end user experience is like as people are engaging in applications. Not only where are they going and what are they clicking, but how performant is it? What's the experience like from a performance perspective?
You were talking now, just thinking about this. We mentioned internal applications. If I'm in the office, makes sense. But we started the conversation from remote worker.
Yeah.
And basically working from anywhere. So if I'm working from home or from Starbucks and I need to access internal application, do I need a VPN tool? Or is there something that's embedded or can help there as well?
Yeah. So most organizations today for remote workers have obviously the long standard tools an SSL VPN or a VPN of some sort, Global Protect or any Connect if you're a Cisco shop. Those have been the standards. They have their own levels of risk and concern around them. That evolved and gave way to what we call now the zero trust network architectures, right? ZTNA solutions, which are more, kind of agent based. I'm going to get the traffic to a cloud node, and then that cloud node is going to authorize that traffic and only the HTTPS or HTTP traffic to go to that site internal to your network or DMZ or wherever it might be for the company. That has been, delivered through an agent, much like a VPN, or sometimes it's delivered as a packed file or agentless. Island has taken that concept of ZTNA and brought it directly to the browser. Again, because Chromium has networking constructs already built into the project, we're able to leverage those to actually route the traffic. So if let's say, let's use an example of a SharePoint server that's internal. You launch Island, your homepage comes up, you're sitting at Starbucks, you click that SharePoint icon in your homepage. Island knows for that application is actually stored and the destination is actually inside the internal network. So for that application, the browser will route that traffic directly to the cloud and then through the cloud to a connector inside the network and directly to that application without ever breaking that SSL connection. So it's secure from the browser to the server, but Island handles all the traffic.
It's very seamless in this way.
Yeah. And the end user is completely oblivious. They didn't have to click a VPN or turn anything on. They just launch Island and click the button.
We'll switch topics a bit.
Yes.
There's very popular thing you mentioned by yourself, so you kind of dig the hole to yourself. You mentioned ChatGPT. So we have a question from LinkedIn. What's the difference between Island GPT Assistant and ChatGPT?
Oh, very interesting. So we will anonymize the request going in, right? So when organizations are concerned, you saw the Samsung news, you see, other organizations are accidentally leaking information. When it comes out of the Island AI, it's coming out anonymized. So it's not going to be attributed back to your individual organization. So as the language model continues to learn, we're offering some obfuscation there. Long term, that chat assistant will be affected and actuated with policy. So when you think about DLP controls, source code controls, and the like, we'll be able to make sure that if you don't want source code going into that assistant, if you don't want intellectual property or confidential information coming out of a document and getting pasted into that, we can offer those same controls directly into that.
I think that's an important part. And I've been thinking about how you help to protect the company, but right now everybody also afraid on the security level of the company itself. I mean, Island. Can you talk a bit about more what you guys do to make sure you code is secure as well, and there's no vulnerabilities in Island itself? Because we do find vulnerabilities in Edge, Chrome from time to time.
Absolutely, and based off of Chromium, we all know there's vulnerabilities in Chromium itself that actually have nothing to do with Island code, and we are very aware of that, and for that matter, we stay at the exact same release schedule as Google and Microsoft. So when there's patches to the underlying Chromium, there's no degradation or slowness in our response. Now, when it actually comes to Island itself, our management backend, the actual code, we have achieved, SOC 2 Type 2 accreditation. We're about to embark on ISO 27001 later this year. We've hired ahead of our federal markets, so we will be embarking in the US on a FedRAMP and IL certification, which is another level of attestation to our back end and the components used there. And then we've undergone both, third-party pen tests as well as rigorous pen testing across our existing customers and financial services. So we have numerous artifacts around the security of our back end as well as the security of our executable. That being said, there are no guarantees in life, right? So ways in which we've architected ourselves to protect organizations. Number one, every organization can bring their own encryption key to our back end. So any data that might be stored, any policy data, any user information that's stored in our back end can be encrypted in their key. and not using anything default, right? So there's step one. Step two, we've architected ourselves in an always-on mode. So if our management backplane should become unavailable, the browser has the context, it will run with last known good policy, so the browser can always function in a offline or disconnected way. So we've done things architecturally, we've done things from back-end code protection to make sure that we're not the part of the supply chain that causes harm.
Yeah, the idea of browser running without internet or isolated way is kind of interesting, but I guess, yes, if something happens, there's no connection to your management, you can still run and operate in individual things, basically.
Yeah.
Exactly. We have another question from the audience, from Alessandro. As browsers evolve, so does the enemy. Which threat technology behavior do you think it will be the most threatening to browsers, and by extension to island and enterprise browsers as a whole?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing right now is what you consider the man in the browser, which is all around credential harvesting, which is, can I force a pop-up in the browser window that looks like it's re-authenticating your Microsoft credentials or your domain Azure AD credentials of the like. These are often very well masked because they pop up from the context of whatever site you're on. And they look very legitimate. And so I think this is probably one of the biggest attack vectors. And again, this is all credential harvesting. They're not truly exploiting the browser as much as they are grabbing your creds for later ransomware types of attacks or other types of attacks against the domain. But in this case, one of the ways in which Island is helping from an anti-phishing or credential protection perspective is we have a number of credential protections that are based in there. Number one, obviously we have our own URL categorization. So if we see something pop up that didn't originate from the site, it's coming from a third URL, we can block things like that by default. So for example, if you're in ServiceNow and all of a sudden a pop-up window comes up and it's a URL that's not associated with the ServiceNow domain, we can programmatically stop that pop-up from coming up or prevent it from actually displaying content. Other things we can do is we can build an anti-phishing policy based off of domain certificate. So Google launched Let's Encrypt years ago, right, to push the adoption of SSL certs and HTTPS. Almost all of the certs produced in this free service are what we call domain level certs, meaning they're level 1 certs, just saying that the domain that is owned, that you're on, is owned by a human being, and they have an address and they have information, and this domain is real. Anybody could do that. So we can by default not trust level 1 certs. So if we see you entering your credentials on any site that has a level 1 cert, we can prohibit that from happening. So why is that interesting? Because Microsoft, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Oracle, none of them are using level 1. They're all using EV certs, all trusted back to their actual business and entity.
We're going to ask some business questions. We have a couple
Yes, please do.
here. This is a good one. What type of questions do you see companies missing to ask when you talk to them?
I think that's, wow. Okay, so that's asking from a different perspective. I think, one of the challenges right now is as we build a category, folks, especially security professionals, aren't exactly sure what they should be asking. They aren't sure, when they think about a browser, what are the areas I need to think about? Like, your question was great. What if the island service goes down? What ends up happening? Things like that, I don't think folks have already thought through all the way. As we become more of a defined category, as this becomes a little bit more commonplace in the industry, I think that'll kind of, naturally attenuate. The reality is, this is the first time some folks have ever thought about an enterprise browser and what it could actually do for the business. So having those questions top of mind isn't exactly there, as opposed to something like anti-malware, which they've been deploying and using and has been around for decades. We know what questions to ask. You're going to ask about dead agents. You're going to ask about updates. You're going to ask about, what is the update size and how is it not going to bring down my network, and how do you get that file size? So all of those things are very programmed into us. The browser's new, so people are figuring out what's important to their organization.
Great. Follow up on this one. How businesses work with security vendors to improve the security posture? I guess basically the question here is, if I'm going to my management and I say, hey guys, I want to use Island or similar enterprise browser, how would it improve my posture to explain to the board level in the business? Like, why do I need it?
I'll tell you where, so we've actually now across our customer base have gotten to the point where when folks are thinking about deploying us to organizations that are, 500,000 users, we're getting to CEO level, executive level conversations when they're trying to push this out. And what they're not at that level, they're not talking about security. They're talking about user experience. What can they provide the user that's different from what they get today? And in those customers, what they're doing is they're giving the user access and convenience that they haven't had. So what does access look like? Well, before, a lot of companies wouldn't let people go to their personal Gmail, wouldn't let them go to messaging sites because they couldn't really govern what they were doing there. With Island, they have complete governance around that. So they give employees access back. And then how does convenience factor in? One of the things that we do, and we thought it was the simplest thing when we started Island, but it's actually becoming such a huge area of value, is each user gets presented their own browser homepage, made up of all their application entitlements, things they need to do, places, jobs they have to finish, tasks they need to complete in the HR system, anything. It can be completely customized. So having that kind of unique, centralized point that every single user gets in the browser, something they use every day, it's been a huge selling feature for our customers.
I think it's very, very great. We have a couple of minutes left. So folks here on LinkedIn, YouTube, please ask some of the last questions. And if not, we're gonna transition. And don't forget, it's recorded, it will be available. We're gonna put the link here again right now. As Brian mentioned, this is a very, very new category, a very interesting category. And I believe I have my own assumption what's going to happen with the category, but I kind of keep it to myself and let's see how it goes. Because it's on the endpoint, so I envision some of the endpoint companies will be interested to be in this. And I keep it there. So let's see if there are any more questions from LinkedIn, YouTube, or here as well. And if not, we will put later on the who wants the t-shirt as well. Maybe Brian, maybe you need the t-shirt. I have my security architecture t-shirts. We just we actually covered many vendors, including you guys, on the part of the season. So we're very interesting to see what's going to happen there. Oh, I don't see any more questions. So I guess we'll wrap up here. So thank you, everyone. It was great to have everyone on the call. Brian, thank you for all the insights. You really explained this in a very simple way. And I think we covered the technical aspect and the business aspect as well. So thank you for being here, and everybody that listen and ask questions. Thank you for participating. We're going to have a next event. It's going to be AWS for probably small, medium businesses, where we explain where and how to start in the security level, also a very important part. So everyone, thank you very much. Brian, thank you very much, and have an awesome day.